You're listening to Kitchen Table Finance. Join Dave Shotwell and Nick Nauta as they cut through the complexity of financial planning and serve bites of investment advice that are both personal and practical.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
Nick, how are you?
Sun's out, so it must be podcast
My
day.
wife had just told me this morning that we had entered the time of year when we wouldn't see the sun in forever, and it is bright and sunny out, and almost I think it's 38 degrees. Nothing to complain about.
Wow,
no kidding.
Heat wave
this
up north.
Beautiful.
Look out.
Go for a walk here in a little bit.
There you have it. So this is episode 2 in our series of retirement planning headlines and what they may or may not mean for your upcoming
our little
right?
roundup of things we've read over the last couple of weeks that are out there in the media.
So interestingly enough, our lead story is an interview with Mr. Charlie Munger, who sadly passed away 2 days ago now at the ripe old age of 99.
Yes, we had.
Want to let our listeners know who Charlie Munger was?
Charlie Munger
Dave?
is best known as Warren Buffett's right-hand man at Berkshire Hathaway. Considered a brilliant investor in his own right and just a real down-to-earth, cool guy. I consider him my favorite fellow Wolverine, although he did not graduate from the University of Michigan. He left to join the Army in World War II. Just an interesting guy. There are literally books of his wit and witticism out there, and he gave a pretty cool interview that was published in the Wall Street Journal, which is what made our list here before he passed away.
Yeah, I was somewhat surprised by because I knew he just did this, and then it wasn't long after, a week or two, that he passed. But and another tidbit, I've been reading a lot on Charlie Munger. I guess supposedly, and I don't know if you lived in this dorm or not, but he has a dorm named after him that has dorm rooms with no windows in them.
Yeah. I'm not sure the details of that, but I've heard about that.
Apparently he designed it so that people or students would go out and mingle with each other because they like sunlight. So he restricted it from their rooms. Different times, probably different codes. Right. Who knows? Interesting though.
So some of the comments from his interview here from a few weeks ago, he was asked about stock picking, and I loved his response. Why should I try to pick my own stocks if I'm an individual investor? I don't design my own electric motors.
You're right.
Right.
Or his own ag meters. Which is interesting because the man is famous and a billionaire for picking his own stocks.
Then I love this little witticism. Who in the hell with my wealth lives in the same house he built himself 70 years ago? It was his comment on not trying to inspire the next generation of stock pickers.
Yeah, I find that super interesting about both him and Buffett. One, that they're both, living in the same house they've had for years, even though they're two of the wealthiest guys in the world. But also this fact that neither one of them really wants to inspire the next generation of them because they're not really sure it can be done like it was when they were.
There's that aspect of that comment. And then there's also the aspect that I love about both Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, that they've never, they are. So I just reread, I think for at least the second time, if not the third time, The Millionaire Next Door. And they're not the millionaires next door; they're the billionaires next door, right? They both live in these modest houses, driving, cars that they could afford a whole fleet of the car that they own, but just still connected to the world in a way that you wouldn't expect.
Yep, neither of them have private jets or things like that.
Right.
Even though they could. I think Buffett now has a rental service. He doesn't own his own, but you're talking about the fourth, fifth richest guy in the world.
And you and I are both very interested in the behavioral finance and cognitive biases that go with retirement planning and investing. And I loved this comment too. There are lots of cognitive biases that are significant. One is the constant tendency to overrate your own intelligence and skills in deciding what to do and what not to do. And, that's pretty interesting insight from a guy who's considered to, who could easily have a huge ego about what he's doing. And we would all be like, well, yeah, of course he has, he's justified in it by the results. But it echoes something that Daniel Kahneman, who's one of the, original behavioral finance gurus, said that he was asked by another author what the worst cognitive bias is, and he said it was ego. So,
right.
And both Munger and Buffett have always been masters of their ego when it comes to investing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that really sticks out, and there was a quote in this article and another quote that he's known for, and just that, he goes on to say, one of the reasons I was economically successful in life is because he read so much his whole life, starting when he was about 6. And he also talks a lot about, like, it's not necessarily about the smartest. It's about the person that continues to learn and continues to get better and improve. And so it's interesting because him and Buffett were both that way in terms of,
It echoes the old cliche of not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers. So, yeah, for sure. So, moving on our list, Wall Street Journal had an interesting piece a few weeks ago titled How to Know When It's Time to Retire. This is right up our alley, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, interesting statistic. Average retirement age was 62 in this year, 2023, which is up from the age of 57 in 1991. So in about 22 years, the retirement age has increased by about 5 years. So I thought, obviously interesting. I don't have the stats on how long life expectancy has increased in that time, or if it has. I have to assume that it has. But I thought that was interesting. I'm curious if that tracks with, like, how much life expectancy has increased.
I believe that you would see an increase, but it wouldn't be one for one in this case. Seems like retirement age is growing a little faster.
So kind of the premises behind this was, if you wait too long, you might regret the extra years you gave to work. But if you leave too early, you could feel lost in your new life, which is a real thing as far as, people retiring early and not quite sure what to do.
We've talked about this idea quite a bit, I think, over the last year or two here, that there's a lot more to deciding when you're going to retire than just, are you financially able to retire? So,
and I always, say that the people that I know that retire successfully are the ones that are retiring to something, not from something, right? And it does take some time and effort in thinking through, like, what that means. Like, obviously you're, leaving the workforce, but for many of us, especially Americans, that defines a large part of who we are. And so if you're not ready to replace that, you might be floundering a little bit. And I thought, I don't know if it was Teresa who wrote the article or she was quoted in it, but she did have some interesting insight in terms of how to kind of handle or think through some of that stuff, which I think a lot of us don't really do very well. I tell people all the time, it's, you spend 30 years planning for retirement financially, but you spend about 30 seconds actually thinking about, the why of that and what you actually want to do. And which is why that's such a big part of our process for people that are retirement planning, is figuring out the why and what's next and what you want out of life. But she had some interesting insight. One of her tips was just to start by listing the 6 words that best describe you and thinking about how retirement might change some of those descriptions.
It's a great way to.
So, for example, if being a salesperson is your most cherished identity, maybe you're not ready to think through, retire and not be a salesperson anymore, or whatever that title is. And I always,
go ahead. Be ready to fill that sentence in with something different.
Mm-hmm. And I always liked, so we have a worksheet that we do as a part of our process, and we can go ahead and put this up in the show notes, but it's our ideal day, week, year, where you're just kind of going through and being like, okay, if I didn't worry about anything, this would be my ideal way to spend a day. And this would be an ideal way to spend a week and a year. And then you kind of compare that to your current. And I think that helps a lot of people think through, like, what are the changes I need to make and how does that help me? And, is work a part of that right now that's important, or is it not? Or is it maybe less of it? And thinking through some of that stuff, I think people find very useful as a part of this kind of overall conversation.
So, third
pivot here to the investment
a little more
side
technical
of things, Dave.
here, but interesting. And I think it applies to a lot of individual investors out there. 3 big reasons exchange traded funds went mainstream with investors from CNBC. So just in a nutshell, exchange traded funds are portfolios of stocks or bonds that trade on an exchange like stocks rather than the way mutual funds traditionally trade. So they generally are more tax efficient, and they generally track an index and are lower cost than actively managed mutual funds. And a lot of individual investors see exchange traded funds as being synonymous with passive investing now. So I would add to that list the fact that most major discount brokerages, Schwab, E-Trade, Fidelity, now will let you trade most exchange traded funds with no trading costs. So they can be an effective tool. They're building blocks like any other part of any other tool you might use to build a portfolio. Got to use them right.
Yeah, and not to mention, like, just the advent or the invention of, I don't know if invention is the right word, but, we have all these online brokerage firms now, where it used to be you'd have to, call a broker to make a trade. And so they would, for lack of a better word, sell you a mutual fund, or now you can go in and find things on your own. And, and so I think there's a lot more of that, but also I think it's a lot more prevalent, people like understanding and being more conscious of what fees are. And, passive investing has a strong story right now, if you look at it and compare it to active investing. And so, we're starting to see those track records come through, and turns out it's really, really hard to consistently beat the market.
And, in our own portfolio models, we use a lot of exchange traded funds. We do use traditional mutual funds as well, depending on what's the best fit. So, tools. Yeah. Just tools. But that article makes a good intro point for people that are interested in learning more about exchange traded funds and why they're seen as as a good tool these days.
Yeah. So our next article, Dave, comes to us from Click on Detroit. And as it turns out, Michigan, our lovely home state here, ranks as one of the best places to retire in the U.S.
Yeah.
If you can believe
They're basing
that.
this on a U.S. News study where they actually polled seniors in retirement, looking at different aspects of quality of life. And lo and behold, we've got Grand Rapids, Lansing, Ann Arbor, Detroit, and Kalamazoo all ranking in the top 100 in the country.
Yeah, I guess, initial reaction is surprising somewhat to see Detroit on there. Most people don't think of Detroit as a good place to retire. I guess it depends on the criteria that you have. But also, cost of living, things like that have a big impact on a survey like this. And if nothing else, cost of living in Michigan, it tends to be pretty good.
The interesting thing, I think, for people planning retirement with these articles is not the outcomes per se, like grabbing that magazine and saying, oh gosh, Lansing's really high on this list, I should move to Lansing. The value of these isn't the outcomes, which are just clickbait, if you will. It's really about the process, right? Look at the questions that they asked these people and how people responded, and ask yourself, are those the things that are important to you? because you may get very different results, or you may find that the things that bumped Ann Arbor to the top of the list aren't as important to you as some of the things that might be drawbacks from your point of view. So, right.
Yeah, like winter.
Yeah. Notice none of these are north of the 45th parallel, but it's more about the thought process than the actual outcomes. And I always find these interesting to at least get the conversation started with people. Like, where do you want to be? Why would you want to be there? What's important to you? Not what's important to click on Detroit's, U.S. News's study.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me. I see a lot of these, and like you said, like depending on what is going into the survey or the rankings, like, I mean, theoretically, we could probably come up with a ranking system that took all of these 100 places and they didn't show up on the list, right? Yeah. So it's really more about thinking through the process of what's important to you if you are considering moving in retirement, and what does that look like? And then, doing and finding either a ranking system that's already done it for you, or doing your own research on what those important things are to you. So our next article is an interesting one. I've seen a lot of buzz on social media about it, and it comes to us from the Wall Street Journal. And it's titled Income Raise Happiness.
Yeah.
I believe it was done on a bigger study. Is this the one that was done on the bigger study by one of the 401k providers? I think
a couple different studies here looking at these links, but essentially looking at, like, depending on what your income is, what's the utility of making more money on happiness. And my favorite thing here was as I read it, they quoted one of my favorite writers on the topic, Elizabeth Dunn, whose book Happy Money, I think we did a review here like 2 years ago of that book. Professor.
Yeah, if not, we definitely should.
We didn't do that. I remember, I'm pretty sure we did it. We could look that up and link to it in the show notes. But, her book, Happy Money, informs a lot of our day-to-day conversations with people. And the basic idea is, once you get beyond a certain basic living income, the value of money in terms of happiness flatlines. And so this article is a good intro to that idea, and kind of puts in perspective the fact that the more money you make, the more money you think you need to make for happiness, but the actual results don't bear that out.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And again, I can't remember if this probably a part of this study, but like, it doesn't matter where you're at on the income spectrum. Pretty much everyone feels like they need more, right? So like, even if you're making, $250,000, you feel like you'd be happier if you were making 350, right? And like like all the studies that they do show that that's not true, but that's kind of like the feeling. And it goes back to, I think this was in one of Morgan Housel's books, and I know we brought it up on this before, but, and I'm going to butcher who said it. I think it was, J.D. Salinger, maybe, but they were talking about how much money this hedge fund manager made, and he said, "Yeah, but I've got
that was one of my favorite writers, Joseph Heller." So for once, I'm not the one misquoting somebody. I can actually tell you it was Joseph Heller, and yes, yeah.
But yeah, just this interesting comment of like, it doesn't matter how much money you make. It really, what you should really focus on is understanding and feeling like you have enough, and making more money is never a good way to feel like you have enough, right? I think that's like the general point is, every time you make more money, that you just raise the bar again.
The hedonistic treadmill is the fancy word for it. So yeah.
Yes.
I loved this one when I saw it, and because it's done kind of tongue in cheek too, but how to avoid being boring at 60. And this was in the Wall Street Journal a week or two back, and this is about a guy as he turns 60, I think his comment was he realized that his friends didn't want to keep hearing the same stories over and over. So he needed to go out and find some new stuff to talk about. And so he set some rules. I thought I thought this thought process was really cool. It was like, this is not a bucket list in the normal sense, right? One of his rules was no stereotypical stuff like jumping out of an airplane. But also nothing so dangerous that he might not be able to do the other 59 things on his list. So, bullfighting was out, and nothing went on the list that was just a matter of spending money. If it was just a matter of saying, I'm going to go buy this experience, it didn't count. And then he eliminated anything that was too simple or easy to do, and things that were too complex. Like I think his example was like raise a pig from a piglet all the way through to, and then butcher it and make a fancy dinner. Nothing that was going to take the whole year just of itself. So examples he gave were he was not a cook, so he cooked an extravagant meal for his family. Where it wasn't an easy, box macaroni and cheese kind of deal. He got a full menu of several courses, spent a whole day doing it, and fed his family. I thought that was pretty cool. And then he went on a police ride along. I'm not sure how you arrange that.
Wow.
But, he had some interesting experiences out of that. This one, he attended a mega church, because he had never, he'd always heard about these things and never known what to think of it.
Yeah.
And the last one, and I'm going to a Arts Council fundraiser tonight, so I thought this was kind of funny. He bid on art at an auction and then had to sweat it out that he was going to actually win the auction. His goal was to not come home with a piece of art, but he had to bid on something. And So these are just a few examples of his 60, but each one of these things, he said, made him think about the world a little bit differently. And each one turned out a little different than he had envisioned. So, we spend a lot of time talking about goals and retirement, things you want to do, and we get a lot of stereotypical answers. So I just thought this was kind of a cool way to think about different ways to liven up.
Yeah, no, I love everything about that. I mean, none of that stuff, like you said, is just spending money, but I'm sure he's got some pretty interesting stories to tell. And things
he won't be as boring.
That hopefully his friends want to hear. Yeah. That's right. So our next article, Dave, comes to us again from the Wall Street Journal. I'm pretty sure it's no secret what you and I read the most of. But this is an interesting one to me on personal finance. And the headline was, now is a bad time to spend money.
Right.
I guess, so the question is there a good time to spend money?
It's all relative, right? And it's
right, exactly.
I liked your comment in the notes about it, because I think you nailed it, that it's a bad time to spend money you don't have. And so what they're getting at is interest rates are high, right? So if you're borrowing money, if you're a net spender, then you're going to pay more for it now than you have, for most of our adult lives, right? But if you're a saver, you're going to be paid more to save. So you take both of those things together, and it's a really lousy time to spend money. It's a great time to be a saver. It's a bad time to be a net spender. So being financially responsible right now is more important than ever.
Which is extremely difficult considering the pressure of Christmas and, all the advertisers are out in full force, and Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all the deals and all that stuff. So again, being financially responsible is probably more important than it's been, just given where the rates are, and also the uncertainty of the economy and the things in the future of how that might all pan out. But it's not a podcast episode of Kitchen Table Finance without talking about things like
and
an
budgets,
emergency fund, right?
Being responsible,
and a budget. And, the best time to start planning for Christmas spending is the day after Christmas, because you have the most time to save up. And so what you should be spending right now is a year's worth of saving from last year. And so obviously not everybody's in that situation, but this is where pre-planning makes so much more sense, because like we said, it's not necessarily a bad time to spend money. There's some really good deals out there, and it's a great time to be able to give gifts to people. But if you haven't planned for it starting, 12 months prior, then it might be a bad time for you to spend money or spend more than what you had planned on. So again, one of those clickbait headlines things where, people get too caught up in some of this stuff, but good sound financial principles, if you've been practicing those, then it's not necessarily a bad time.
So our last one here to close out November, harbinger of conversations to come, I think.
It's too early,
Here we go.
But it's starting.
Let the games begin. Investors fear the 2024 elections may hurt retirement savings, from CNBC.
Yes.
So, yeah. There's always going to be plenty to worry about, and you can always count on Washington making a crisis out of everything that they possibly can. So, in a way, I don't want to dismiss people's concerns over the election in markets. We don't want to dismiss those out of hand, but if you step back and think about how politics really works and how the markets really work and how the economy really works, you'll likely see that most of this is overwrought.
Yep. A lot of, and we've done a podcast on this, well, it's probably about 4 years ago on the 2020 elections. And, I think a lot of that will hold true again. And it's just a matter of, like, if you look at the facts behind the market impact of president, whether it's Democratic or a Republican president, there's not really a whole big difference one way or the other. So if you're voting for the market, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you vote on, right?
Yeah, it doesn't. The effects aren't there or aren't statistically relevant over history. But this article says, a poll cites that 68% of Republican voters and 57% of Democratic voters expect that the election outcome will impact the stock market and the economy. So, so that perception and that reality are not the same. So,
absolutely. And, just like every election year, you're going to see an uptick in volatility, the market going up and down. But once we have a conclusion, it's probably, going to go back to a more normal cycle. The other interesting thing, and we can end on this one, Dave, but there's been some fear or some things thrown around about how Social Security might be on the ballot this year in terms of who gets elected and what they potentially do with it. You care to take on that?
I feel like I should have this on a recording where I could just push a button when the question comes up. But in a nutshell, again, not to dismiss concerns. There are concerns about Social Security's viability, but there are very realistic things that when push comes to shove and we get past the crisis talk, there are some very real things that can be done that make Social Security perfectly viable, that are going to hurt everybody a little bit, but nobody too much. And we would expect there'll be some kind of compromise, because at the end of the day, what do they call Social Security? How many times have we said it on this podcast in different forms? It's the third rail of American politics. Again, I should have it on a t-shirt or something, but, no politician survives touching the third rail, right? So
that's right.
They're going to make it sound very scary. I always think of the Daryl Hammond playing Al Gore back in 2000, on Saturday Night Live, talking about putting Social Security in a lockbox like it was a prisoner that he was never going to release. And, so this is nothing new. And it will continue, and it will continue to sound very scary.
And you're going to continue to see stuff like this in the headlines. And so you're going to have to figure out a way to, come back to, maybe you play this last 30 seconds of this podcast on a loop every time you read something on Social Security. Right.
And our recent post on how to deal with the media. because it all, I mean,
there you
it's
go.
very
Love
much
it.
part and parcel.
With that being said, Dave, second installment, I believe, was a success. Looking forward to see what they decide to write about here in December, and we'll be back with in January with an update. It has been a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
This is a Zedia Media production.